that are homeless, who suffer from mental illness, who refuse any treatment, and you offer services as best you can, but in a society that I want to live in, I'm not going to force anybody into incarceration. I'm not going to force them to be treated. That kind of impinges on other civil rights and liberties, and that's where it's a balancing act. And I'm not suggesting that we're ever going to live in a perfectly balanced society. There will always be that. You know, I'm fond of saying that my clients are criminals and psychotic, but if you have money, you're just eccentric. So it's, you know, again, it's your circumstances, and I just want to address this problem with as much humanity and professionalism as possible. Yes, sir.
You sort of covered it, but it was 52 years ago that Community Mental Health Act of '63 opened the gates.
Always somebody smarter than me.
Well, you know what it is. And so we've had 52 years of people supposedly being treated in their communities, outpatient, inpatient, whatever it takes. And we know you've covered how that's not working. And you've talked about a lot of the impacts in terms of cost and prison and the court systems and all that. Could you talk a little more generally about the effects that a lot of people don't see this? It's like druggies. Unless you've had a drug person in your family, you're not aware of all that goes into a drug abuser or living with one. But these people who aren't getting treatment are walking around, as this gentleman just said a minute ago. But what are the impacts of all that, other than just dollars? What's the effect on our community?
Well, you know, again, I'm placed in that being on one end of the fulcrum, and then you have, I guess, those who are wanting to incarcerate these people on the other end. You have, and in the middle of this, you have law enforcement. You know, when I talked about costs and what's involved in incarcerating or holding these people, what we've neglected to include in the costs are things such as my office, the attorney, the hours, the manpower spent there, the state's attorney's office. Law enforcement, instead of dealing with crime, they're dealing with quality of life issues, so they're taken off the streets, so I feel less safe as a result of it. But at the same time, I can't help but sympathize with those merchants, for instance, in downtown who have to, and I hate to use the word those people or them or that, because it's dehumanizing. They're human beings. But I don't want my friend who has a business downtown to have to every morning clean up where someone has defecated or has set up camp. You know, or if I live there, I live in a neighborhood where, you know, I see homeless frequently. And again, if it was a huge concentration, I would probably be more upset by it. But otherwise, they're just people. Now I've got neighbors who say, I get rid of those, I shoo them away. I mean, it's frightening to see how different people react to it. I think if we demystify it and we realize that people who do suffer from mental illness, we have created this notion, and every time there is a mass shooting, we decided that we're going to address it as a mental health issue and not a gun issue. And I'm not even going to get into that debate, except for the fact that they're two entirely separate issues.
Don't you dare.
I'm sorry?
Don't you dare get into that discussion.
And so it frustrates me, you know, we're not addressing the problem, and the vast majority of those individuals suffering from mental illness are not dangerous, but yet we have mystified it to the point where we're afraid of them. And that's, I want to demystify. Most people who are suffering from mental illness, I might be dangerous, but I'm not that dangerous.
Follow up just briefly.
No, I got a question. All right, go ahead, Father.
Whose son is schizophrenia.
Has schizophrenia, and her search to get help for him is a titanic struggle.
Well,
all the time, she's his advocate, and he's like 30 now, and functioning sort of, but to see that he gets help and medicines and all the other things and treatment for other things is a monumental struggle.
Listen, I have been with the Public Defender's Office for 30 years. I have clients, actually I have clients now, they're all my clients technically, but but I have had people that I have represented over 24 years as an attorney, an acting attorney within the office. And I've seen my client come in with his parents. His parents were young and vital and helpful, and they supervised him, and we were able to manage, even though he was involved in the criminal justice system. I see his parents' health failing, and now what happens when they're gone? Because there's no one there to take care of it. So I see, I mean, there are so many ramifications that, you know, the fact that I have people calling me with family members and they don't know what to do because there's no help available to them. And so what do they end up doing? They call the police because, well, that person did hit me, so I can get battery charges on them, so I can initiate criminal proceedings so that maybe they can get some treatment. That's a sad indictment of where we're at. So you're right. I'm sorry. I have to be cynical at this point because we're not treating it correctly. And we're not putting sufficient resources into it. And
I do have a question.
is that funny because I'm done or no? No, not done.
He's coming out for re-election.
You can. I'm going to let you ask a question, but this gentleman has been quiet.
No, I've got a question right now.
She has the microphone.
You know, mental illness is a gigantic category. It runs from neurotic maladaptation to something that is a disadvantage, like you talk about your depression as a disadvantage. It doesn't stop you from functioning and functioning well, obviously, given the position you've gotten in society. There are people who have mental illness that scientific research now is indicating is definitely driven by the neurology of the brain.
Kathy, where's
Right.
the question?
How do you recreate the community that can differentiate that? That's one of our real issues. We've lost a sense of community where we know who the people are in our town. And when I grew up, it was a small town. We knew there were 3 people that
Kathy?
I can't say it. Okay, so
You're not. I got a microphone too. Ask a simple
believe-
question and I'll give a simple
okay.
answer.
I believe that we need to.
My question
fund-
doesn't start with I believe that. What is your question?
1, 2, 3. Are we going to be able to pressure our state in order to delegate funds in order to make these decisions?
Well, again, we're looking at, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a social scientist. I don't know, I mean, best practices are evolving constantly. What we did 50 years ago,
Right.
we would consider barbaric in the treatment of the mental illness today. So there's a constant evolution. I don't have a definitive answer. Some of the answers frighten me because I don't want to live in that kind of state. Questions that you've asked. I don't want to herd people together and we can, you know, I would like to think that we can live in a sufficient state of community where we can take care of people who are in need of being taken care of.
Okay, I'm going to people that haven't asked questions so far. Just a moment.
It's so much fun cutting her off.
Thank you. I definitely have an answer for you. I represent NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Sarasota County. And
I've had the pleasure of speaking to your people on several occasions.
okay, well, we're going to harass you some more in a positive sense. But you made the comment that many family members of loved ones that come before you don't know what to do. And NAMI is getting itself revitalized in the Sarasota County area. And one of the things that, two key things we offer for some time is family support groups, where adults of loved ones go with peer-trained people to facilitate support groups. And that's free. There's one in Sarasota, one in Venice, once a month. And then there's a family-to-family 12-week program for parents or grandparents or brothers or sisters of loved ones to walk them through a 12-week program on how you deal with mental illness, how you cope with the system, the medications, coping skills, and all that sort of stuff.
I'm not suggesting that there aren't a lot. There isn't help out there. My frustration is, as I said, directly with the criminal justice system. That's what I was called here for. But Carrie is here, and I went up to St. Petersburg to see a program called the Vincent House, which was an extraordinary program, and it was treatment through vocational training and job placement. I mean, they made it quite clear, we don't do counseling here. We find people jobs. And so there are like you said, there are varying levels of mental illness that respond to different things. It's just trying to enhance an individual's quality of life who does suffer from an illness, who is not, in my estimation, and what I'm saying again and again, is not a criminal.
Goodwill does that too, training.
This is on a slightly more of a suggestion than a question.
Don't have a microphone to cut him off on it,
Well, you gave away your microphone.
I'm prone to do that.
Last week I was in Tallahassee with another group to which I'm meeting with legislators and representatives. And in the course of that meeting, State Representative Kathleen Sanders from St. Petersburg, I don't know if you know her or not, but if you don't, you should. She stood on the floor of the House and addressed all of us and said that her personal mission this year as a state representative was to deal with the issue of mental health and its decriminalization. So that might be someone that you might want to.
And I can tell you, I mean, I am part of an association, which is the Public Defenders Association, and we have a standing committee dealing with mental health legislation and working with that. There was a number of significant bills that stood before the legislature this last go-around. Unfortunately, something happened that we never addressed anything, and that was they couldn't pass a budget. So there was significant legislation that was at the table and shelved, and hopefully will be readdressed. That goes not only with mental health, but there were a number of issues within the criminal justice arena. Not all of my clients suffer from mental illness, and so I have a lot of other issues, like the death penalty, things like that concern me as well. But that's another topic with a different crowd.
Go ahead.
Yes.
When you were talking about competency training, you said a certain percentage are sent to that, and then they are, after a few weeks, almost all of them become competent and stand trial.
No, what happens is once you file the suggestion of incompetency, and then a judge makes a finding based upon the evaluations that were conducted. That person is sent for competency training. There are approximately 2,500 individuals who are at any given time going through competency training. What happens then is if after a period of time, and competency training can take anywhere from 6 months, usually it's not less than 6 months if they're sent out for training, or it can be a matter of years, or the hospital after a number of years can say this person cannot be restored to competency.
So are they then incarcerated during that period?
They're in a hospital. If you fit the criteria for involuntary hospitalization, yes. As a matter of fact, when they come back, they get jail credit for being in that facility.
When you say come back, you mean come back to the...
If the hospital finds them to be, they have restored this individual to competency. They are then returned to the circuit in which the crime was committed to answer to the charges, because now they're competent. Now you've been charged with a crime, and you can answer to that charge. What I stated was that approximately 70% of those individuals who are returned back because their competency has been restored, either plea out to time served, charges are dropped, or they're put on probation. They're not even incarcerated further. They didn't necessarily need to be incarcerated to begin with. But the
And
cost,
what about the other 30%?
they can come back and they're usually more serious charges, and they're not gonna plead to it or be placed for probation or given time served, and they'll answer to the charge, and they'll go to trial. Or they can plead to a negotiated sentence.
So are there some that never go to trial then?
Yes, there are those individuals whose competency cannot be restored.
Right, that's what I was.
They will never go to trial because their mental illness.
And so where do they go?
There are state hospitals for it. I mean, there aren't many. I mean, we've closed out over 80% of the beds, but that means that there's 20%. So we reserve that for those.
How many beds are there in the state hospitals?
Everyone's asking such good questions.
What was the question?
I don't have the numbers. If you want the number, my wife said, if you want the answer, call me and I'll get the answer for you.
Okay, so talking about
You can Google it.
drug, sorry, I have a question about drug addiction. The pill mills, OxyContin has been diminished. It's still an issue, I'm sure, but those pill mills have been closed, but now we're seeing a rise in heroin use in not just here,
Go
communities, right. So, some radical solutions. The country of Portugal completely legalized all drugs and put the money that they were, putting into incarceration toward treatment. And that is not something that I would think I would ever support, except they've been successful. They've actually found people who are against it now support, don't want to see it go back because they have less drug addiction and it's worked. So my question is twofold. Is there a recognition in Tallahassee and among, the community, your colleagues, that this heroin, that we just swapped out OxyContin for heroin? Is there a recognition that this drug thing is just, you've got a different substance now? And what kind of mechanisms do you have for looking at other successful models, even radical ones like Portugal's, that have worked?
I can't answer for our legislative body. I can't go there. But it's hard to deny the reality that we have simply substituted one substance for another. As a matter of fact, it's gotten to the point where and I'm not advocating the use of oxycodone and oxycontin, but at least we knew that when it was a prescribed medication, the purity of it and what it consisted of. It was poison, but it was nonetheless a pure poison. Heroin being sold on the street, we have no idea, which is the problem with any kind of street-level drug. We don't know what it is and what it contains. So have we substituted one for the other? Absolutely. I'm choosing my words very carefully. I'm somewhat intrigued by how much emphasis has been placed on the issue of, oh my gosh, we have to look at heroin use and heroin addiction and heroin overdoses, and we have to start treating them. And I can't help but think of the composition. I tend to look at the economic and racial profile of those who are using certain drugs and how we treat it. I think that there's been a greater recognition. That's a little editorial on the side. I think this videotaping is really, but I think that there's a greater recognition that we need to treat. You heard on National Public Radio this morning when I heard Sheriff Knight talking about that they were given a counter agent for heroin overdoses. So, and they dispensed them. There were 800 doses that were dispensed to the deputies, which I hope to God we don't have 800 overdoses that they have to use it, but it's available to them to counteract the effects of an overdose of heroin. So there is at least that recognition. I know that when I speak to clubs, there is a much different attitude, especially when it comes to issues like marijuana, that they think it's preposterous that we continue to criminalize it. And I'm talking about good Republican clubs that I attend and go to and speak on the issue because they love to prod me on that question. So I believe, again, my two-pronged analysis on most issues is it fiscally responsible and does it enhance public safety? I can argue almost any issue on those 2 points. And I think that the criminalization of drugs does not enhance public safety, and I think it is fiscally irresponsible. As you said, I think the monies could be much better allocated in education and rehabilitation for drug addiction, because you're not going to incarcerate your way out of any kind of drug illness, which is what addiction is.
What specifically and explicitly do you need to solve this problem? What do you need? What needs to happen?
Money.
You know, I make me king for a day. I don't know. I don't have. Again, I have too many quotes, but you know, any jackass can kick down a barn. I've kicked it down. So, what are you pointing to? But it's more important that we have something to substitute. So, as I said, I think addressing and acknowledging, as I'm fond of saying, an argument is a series of premises that lead to a logical conclusion. I don't know what the conclusion is because I want to argue the premises. But if we presuppose what the conclusion is and torture those premises so that it reaches the conclusion that we want, we're never going to get the answer. So, you've made a good point. You've seen best practices where the decriminalization has been effective. If your conclusion is, but we're not going to decriminalize it, you've already decided what your conclusion is. I'm just giving you, for instance, try to give it an example. I'm saying, I want to see what best practices are. I'm always open to change my conclusion based upon the arguments and the premises that are presented to me.
One question here and then.
Very quick question. We know you need to get home. We appreciate your time. If we start by focusing on potentially diverting the $210 million from competency training by exacting pressure on the legislature and redirecting those funds to actually treating mental illness, would that be a good and viable start in your professional opinion?
The optimist in me says yes. The pessimist in me tells me that they'll just simply take the money away and redirect it to something else unrelated to the health. So the point is, we have to push the issue, and we have to be relentless in pushing the issue. You. And again, what I find difficult to comprehend is that I don't know anybody where mental health issues are not part of your family. I just don't. Somebody, you know, it may be somebody you don't like in your family, it might be the mental illness that causes that. But, I mean, it touches everyone.